Canadian investors are using ZSP over any other ETF for exposure to the S&P 500 index. Institutional investors, investment advisors, and DIY investors have all been trusting ZSP with their investment dollars since the fall of 2012. ETFs provide instant access to a portfolio of stocks to an investor in a single, cost-efficient trade. For an investor to own the entire index would require institutional-level trading systems and expertise. To accomplish this, an investor would have to buy 500 stocks at a time, and then as the market moves, it would constantly have to rebalance those 500 stocks several times a year. ZSP simplifies this process by aiming to provide instant access to the 500 stocks in the index in a very easy and low-cost way.
Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble. Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 137. As always, joined with the three amigos, Keith Dicker, Boomer, IceCap Asset Management, Rich Diaz, PGM Global. What's going on, Boomer?
Hey, man. I was funny story for you. Someone was very unkind to me yesterday.
Go on.
Yeah. Wait for the punchline. Mrs. IceCap and I, we were out on our bicycles, just coming back from somewhere, and this guy comes flying up in his car behind me, and he went like, "Boomer, get off the road!" Except it wasn't Boomer; it was another name that wasn't quite nice. Yeah, but it reminded me of you, Rich, because you talked about like people driving cars versus cyclists on the road. You know, the one doesn't quite appreciate.
Were you on your bicycle?
Yeah, we're on our bicycles. Yeah.
Oh man, you're part of the problem.
I know, but we're like, it wasn't on a big highway or anything. Like it's just little neighborhood.
Look at this elitist, eh? Rich?
Yeah, I know.
I'm on the record as being anti-bicycle path, even though I absolutely love cycling and I cycle as much as I can, which is a bit of a paradox, but what are you going to do? Yeah, he's an elite. Were you wearing your helmet, Keith? Very important. You're wearing your helmet.
I was wearing my 49ers ball hat, but
he
was, yeah, he was, I think he had a lot of, he got some self-satisfaction out of yelling at me. And it's funny, like Mrs. IceCap, she's like, "Oh, how can you believe what he said? Like, what are you, were your feelings hurt or anything?" And I'm like, "Come on now, I'm an investment manager. I have no feelings." I just think it's funny that someone would become so angry with somebody over something that's not affecting the world at all.
Man, I
anger
bikers.
About something.
You hate bikers, Steve? Why?
They get on the middle of the road. They think they run the show, and then they get hit, and they're like, "Oh, I can't believe this guy hit me." It's like, you came out of nowhere.
Do not drive around Montreal. Let me tell you, you're not gonna be happy.
Guys, I'm in the south end of Halifax. It's pretty slow here. Like no one's in a rush to do anything. I know what Kitsilano is like, of course, and
lots of bikers and kids.
Yeah, Montreal is a different like country.
Yeah, no, that's a different. Not yet. But I have a story, another National Geographic story. I was up north on my land.
About the Foxies.
Avoiding the fairer sex as one does over the summer. I actually was walking through the forest on the trail and I saw a porcupine and it was freaking gigantic and it scared the living bejesus out of me. So that's my story for the week. Otherwise, it's beautiful and sunny and it's hot in Montreal. Too hot for me. I prefer London weather. But yeah, I saw a gigantic porcupine. That's it. I was
Rich,
terrified.
They can project their needles.
I was quite far. I was about 30 or so yards, but I was just alone in the forest and I saw this giant brown thing and I had like a bit of a heart attack and then I realized it was a porcupine. Thankfully, it was more scared of me than I was of it and it climbed up the tree. So there you go. That's my story for the week.
Boo.
Last week, someone was kind enough to send us a comment on the YouTube comments about the proper way to refer or reference
Foxies.
I guess, yeah, the group of foxes. But thank you for doing that. It was Fox Eye. It was definitely Fox Eye. But,
All right,
but
I got-
porcupines, do you get a bunch of porcupines or is it just one?
It was
And
just
how do
one,
they-
thank God.
And
Porky pie?
how do they reproduce? Like, wouldn't stuff get in the
Very
way? Like,
carefully is what I would say. Very carefully.
yeah. We need to know
Anyways.
if you know the answer to that, send us some more
Yes,
comments.
that's right.
Send us an image.
That's right.
All
Okay,
right,
Steve, line us up. Line us up, man.
I got a story just on housing, government regulation, maybe a little bit controversial. So anyone that's from BC will know where the Okanagan is, particularly Penticton. That's my summer spot. Been going there since a kid every year. Used to do all these hockey camps up there, and my wife and I got married up there a few years ago. So we kind of go back every year. We go visit like all the wineries, all the BC wineries that like the government tries to desperately protect, and puts all these tariffs and taxes on imported wine to protect the BC wine industry. So like people go up there in the summer from Vancouver, they spend a ton of money, they do all these wine tours and rent a boat, go in the lake. And so we rented like an Airbnb. We rented an Airbnb on the lake like 4 or 5 months in advance because we always try to book like something nice, and we'll have like a bunch of couples that will come up with us, and we'll do all the tours and all that stuff. And so we actually just got our Airbnb canceled this week because the host was like, "Oh, sorry, we have to cancel. Like, we're no longer compliant under the new regulations that the BC government has brought forth." So if you guys aren't paying attention, there's obviously a lot of governments around the world that are like anti-Airbnb. It's creating, housing crisis, etc. And so what the BC government has done is says you can no longer Airbnb unless it's your primary residence and you're living there. So basically, like if you've got like a $3 million house, summer house on the lake, you have to be living there. You can't just, so they're saying you can rent out like a bedroom, which of course, like no one's going to do. You want to rent the whole house. And so they were no longer compliant. So they had to shut it down, which I felt was kind of interesting because again, this is like a tourism type of town. There's not a lot of hotels. They're really crappy. They're mostly actually motels. And it's really ultimately going to discourage like investment. I think this is one of those policy measures from government that is so just makes you scratch your head.
Ham-fisted, I think is what they call it. But Keith was going to say something.
No, I was just
Well, let me
to
actually
focus.
unpack that a little bit further. It's funny enough is like on the same week, there's been a whole bunch of reports coming out that about 95% of the grapes, the crop, was actually destroyed this year. So we had this weird sort of winter weather. It was kind of cold and it unthawed, then it froze again. So it actually ended up killing about 95% of the grapes. So you'll see a lot of that will impact the wine
Did
supply.
the CBC do that?
Did they? Is this a new conspiracy theory?
Yes. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I thought you're going down the climate road with it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Anyways, people
But
are
back to
asking
the Airbnb. I mean, I think we all appreciate what the objective is of this new law, I guess. And is it simply a pause on Airbnbs, or is it now permanent? They just can't
Well, it's like
exist in
no,
the
it's like
previous
and
format.
it's province wide, right? So it doesn't really like distinguish and say, oh, like in Vancouver you can do this, but like because it's Penticton, Okanagan, will allow this. Like it's just like a blanket policy, which again I think just ultimately hurts like these more like tourist remote towns. I even think about Vancouver. I mean, it's such a tourism type of city in the summer. Like, there's not enough hotels as it is, and you can't just build a new hotel tomorrow. So I think like I'm not advocating necessarily for Airbnb. I just think there's like adverse impacts of this, and people that think, a $3 million house on Lake Okanagan is going to somehow end up in the long-term rental pool as a result because there's an Airbnb ban. Like no one's taking their $3 million house and renting it out to some local for $4,000 a month. Like it's just not going to happen. And then the other part of that too is partly why it doesn't happen is because the tenancy laws in BC state that you cannot evict a tenant for any other reason than you occupying the property or doing a substantial and major renovation.
Wait, at all? Like even if they damage like they start a meth lab in your
Well,
basement, you can't kick
sure,
them
yeah,
out?
then you can because you violated, your tenancy contract. But like basically, you have to physically occupy, and I think you have to occupy it for I think it's 6 months of the year or 4 months. Yeah, and so
So
like
you have to be a squatter in your own house? Is that what they're implying?
basically what I'm saying is like you can't go to the tenant and be like, hey, you signed a 1 year agreement. It's now month to month. I want to use my home for 3 months this summer because this is the whole point of it. Can you please leave? You can't do that. You have to basically like occupy it for I think it's a minimum of 6
But back
months.
to the, I assume this is the same for what's the other one? Is it the VRBO or Verbo? I think they
Yeah.
call it.
Same
So I
thing.
guess,
It's basically a ban on short-term rentals.
yeah. But if I'm an investor and I save my money, for years and years, and I decide, hey, I don't want to invest it in this stock market, because it's risky, or the bond market because it's going to collapse. Yeah, or something like that. And I say, you know what? I'm going to buy a piece of real estate, property, and rent it out. That's what I'm doing with my savings. And I'm going to use the Airbnb platform or Verbo platform, to for distribution. This is now completely, if not completely, it's ended my investment strategy for my personal savings, correct?
Yeah, I can go on and on. There's another tax they brought in several years ago called the BC speculation tax, which basically states that you have to live in the home for a minimum. You have to live in the home or have it rented out for a minimum of 6 months. So again, if you have like a luxury home on the lake that you use as a summer home, and maybe you go over Christmas. So let's just say you're using it for cumulatively 3.5 months of the year. That technically is subject to the BC speculation tax. The government says you're a speculator and you need to pay, it's 1% as a BC resident, it's 1% of the annual value tax. So if it's valued at $2 million, you're going to pay $20,000 a year.
Okay, here's an idea.
Yes.
Is the word speculator or speculation in the act? Is that the reason they're using? Is this
They use that
specifically
because I think
stated?
it's political framing, right? So it's just
So for everyone who wants to get around this, you simply position that it is not speculation. It's used as a hedge against,
I don't,
yeah, I'm being serious. It's a hedge
and
against
I
your other investments. It's a hedge against, policymakers for doing things like that.
anyways,
Uh,
long story short is I find it very fascinating because 95% of the crop has been kind of wiped out. That will impact these wineries, sort of maybe next year and so forth. But in addition to that, I'm kind of curious to see how the first year of this ban, how that's going to impact a lot of these small towns in that wine region. Again, that the government says they are so hell bent on protecting is actually I think going to have these.
So Steve,
adverse
what's
effects.
happening now in the city in Vancouver with people who had Airbnb, who had condos that were using Airbnb as their distribution platform?
Yeah.
Are they now doing long-term leases or are
I
they
think there's
selling them?
Yeah, I still think there's a lot of people that are kind of skirting around it, which is like, I'll wait for them to shut me down, then I'll kind of figure out what to do then. That's some of it. I also believe, and this is going to be again controversial, people will hate this, but I don't think it's as pervasive as everybody thinks it is. People think that, oh, there's going to be a wave of this Airbnb inventory hitting the market, flooding it. There's so much air. I think in the grand scheme of things, and there's been some studies on it, the actual number of Airbnbs is actually pretty small.
But Steve, it's really important that you do superficial kind of bullshit policy in order to garner as many votes as you possibly can in the run up to a very contentious election that you might lose, rather than implement sensible policy that's nuanced and adjusted for the different livelihoods and intricacies of the different economies that you're meant to be representing. It's very important.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, right. You said it. To that point, the BC election, yeah, it is this fall. I remember, I think at the start of the year, like the BC NDP, which is currently in power, was like uncontested. It was like David Eby slam dunk. Like polls were like all NDP, and all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, in the last like 3, 4, 5 weeks, the BC Conservative Party, which is a brand new party. Okay, it has no ties to Pierre Poilievre of the federal conservative. It's its own BC Conservative Party, has now skyrocketed in the polls. I think they're basically neck and neck or leading the NDP at this point.
I'm looking at it right now. There's a great website for Canadians. It's called 338canada.com. There's a free plug. We should actually have him on. We should try to invite him on as we get closer to next year. I know we should stay away from politics, but it's just such a great website. And what it does is it collates loads of different polls, and then it projects the polling onto seats. And it does it for different, it does it for provincial stuff and national elections as well. It's just a brilliant, brilliant website. I would definitely recommend it. And I'm looking at it right now. It says popular vote projection, NDP 39%, down from 50 only in September of 2022. So you say out of nowhere. And this BCC party, which was basically 0 2 years ago, is now 35%. And this obviously there's a, what's it called? An error term. So degrees of error. What is it called? Anyway, forgot the statistical
Well, basically,
term for it.
so the other party is called the BC United Party.
Yeah, and they've cratered. Yeah.
Well, they cratered because they used to be called the BC Liberal Party.
Oh.
And they rebranded because obviously the Liberals, JTs, they're not looking too hot these days. So they rebranded, and that rebranded, everyone was like, well, who the hell is the BC United Party? What is that? And so they've basically plummeted down the polls. And I think, unfortunately, those two parties between the BC Conservative and the BC United are actually going to split a lot of the vote.
Okay.
So, like, shouldn't that be I don't follow BC politics at all. So, but shouldn't that be a sign to the lads in Ottawa that you are so disliked right now that the provincial party out west has decided to change their name to disassociate themselves with you?
And then one new party calls themselves the BC Conservatives, and they all of a sudden they're at the top of the polls. I mean, it's kind of funny because I also feel like it kind of is like an indicator of like your typical voter, which is like most people don't know what they're voting or who they're voting for, who is even the leader of that party. They're just like, oh, BC Conservative sounds good. I like that Pierre guy.
But I mean, just one more thing on the odds of winning, which is really interesting. So obviously popular vote does not always translate to the odds of winning an election because it's first past the post. You'll note our dear leader promised that he would get rid of first past the post, but never mind that for a second. And so, as you said, it went from 100% probability of winning the most seats, and it just dropped to 78%. So it'll be really interesting. I really recommend people go check out this website. It's really, really cool.
Anyways, that's my Airbnb rant for the day. I do apologize, but that stuff kind of pisses me off. Rich, we had the Canada CPI data that came out this week. This is the last CPI report heading into the Bank of Canada's first, well, not first, but widely anticipated rate announcement in early June. So I don't know if you want to walk us through some of those numbers, but I'll give you some of the highlights here. The CPI growth decelerated in April to 2.7% year over year from 2.9% in March. So it's technically below the Bank of Canada has a target range of 1 to 3%. So we're at 2.7. Food inflation continued to slow, dipping to 2.3% in April. I don't know what that peaked at, 10% or something. The BOC's preferred core measures also slowed, so median and trim eased to 2.6. And the 3-month annualized growth rates, which are closely monitored by the BOC, ticked slightly higher, but we're still at rates below the 2% inflation target.
Yeah.
So overall, I mean, it looked like a pretty positive report, Rich, but I'll let you unpack and go from there.
I mean, am I stepping on the Twinkie bed here a little bit? I guess I am, but I mean, I think so yes, inflation is slowing. It is still, so prices are still rising, just at a lesser rate. I think it's really important to note that. I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say a couple of things that I always think about. Number one is services versus goods. So services are much stickier in general. And services inflation is 4.2%, still well, and basically has been stable at that level. We'll share the chart. It used to basically rock around 2% for the last 10 or so year, or whatever, 11 years or whatever. And it popped up, given that inflation, the spike in inflation was not at all transitory. And now it's basically stuck at 4.2%. There's several reasons for this. One is the strong wages. One is inflation expectations. And so that's, to me, something you really got to think about. It's not clear that the Bank of Canada articulates that stress point. I think it's important. So just to make a differentiation there. Goods, on the other hand, is 1.0. So that continues to fall. And that's dragged down by the things you mentioned. And of course, my favorite, which is the shelter component, and owner accommodation and rental accommodation. And those are still at 6.4, 6.6, and 7.9 respectively. And the contribution is rising relative to core inflation. So it contributes about 2.5% of core. Why is rent going up? Because our population growths are completely out of control, all due to immigration, which we've talked about at length. This has lowered vacancy rates to all-time lows, basically across every single province and every single jurisdiction in Canada. And I think this raises the natural, I always screw that up, level of interest rate that you need to be disinflation or inflationary, that balance. And I think that for me, those are the main takeaways. And then I think, the one more thing is that the core X mortgage interest payments, which is something people started to harp on once they realized they were wrong about the transitory thing, has fallen to 1.8, but that has started to slow. So meaning the mortgage interest cost contribution to total inflation is starting to slow up, basically.
It's basically pulling out of the comps, right?
Right. Your year-on-year compare. That's right. Exactly. Excuse me. Your year-on-year comparison as you go on and your time series carries on. Your comps get harder and harder to beat, and therefore your year-on-year measure starts to fall. And we'll see. But I would just stress that shelter component is really interesting. It also speaks to the weakness of the consumer, but we'll talk about how that affects the BOC.
Somewhere in there, are you saying they're going to hike in June?
No.
I got lost.
No, I thought that was quite clear, sir.
So we're
What's
not quite
your
at the we're not quite there yet. It's next week, right? We do the
is it next week?
Yeah.
Oh,
no,
sorry.
no.
Okay.
Next week we've got BMO's chief economist Doug Porter on the show.
We all do the bet, but June.
He doesn't know it yet,
VOC
but he's
is
going to
June
be
5.
engaged in a Twinkie bet.
We have to make him. We have to force him go to Bay Street and watch him eat a Twinkie if he gets it wrong.
Can you imagine if economists went on Bay Street and ate a Twinkie? How many people would show up to watch it?
I would.
Well, one, Rich. No one cares about Bay Street economists. But from what you just shared, though, you're again, I'm not quite. Are you suggesting that they will cut based on?
I'm suggesting they will not cut.
They will not.
Well, yeah.
Hold on. There's a difference. Are you suggesting what they should do versus what they will do?
I'm suggesting they will not cut.
Okay. Boomer?
And Steve, you're still suggesting that they will cut.
I don't know.
You can change your mind. We got until next week.
I don't
right?
know.
You
I mean, I don't know if it's going to be June or July, but I mean, I think the data is getting there. I mean, as our fearless leader, Krista Freeland, I hate to give her any props here. She notes, for 4 months in a row, inflation has been within the target range and fell to 2.7% in April. This is good news for Canadians. I mean, she called the bottom on inflation last time, so I'm a bit worried that she's doing the cheerleading again. That might start we might start moving higher here once again.
Is she our new contrarian indicator, like the
She
CBC?
kind of is. Basically, fade anything that she says.
Well, she might eventually be right.
Boy.
I don't think we should be that kind of cavalier about it, but who knows?
Remember, wasn't it last year when inflation fell to
it was 2.8. She nailed, honestly, it was so delicious. And I did warn her at the time. I was like, be careful with one data point. Now, to her credit, she's evolved her thinking to now 4 data points in a row, and she's talking about a trend.
Where do we go? We went from 2.8 to back up to 4.
Yep.
2 months after.
That's exactly right.
In her defense, she has blocked you on Twitter, so she's not hearing your warnings, right? So that's.
Oh, I should be so lucky.
Oh boy,
She should come on the Loonie Hour. We'd have her on.
I'd have her on.
Yeah, we would
but
love to have you on if you're listening, or anyone
But
on the
to
team.
to her credit, as Keith said, she's, instead of talking about just one point of data, which is ridiculous, she is making, I think, a very cogent point, which is that it's now 4 months below the upper end of the target band. So, Steve, I mean, it's fair enough.
Okay,
Boomer,
so
what are you
here's
thinking?
here's what's really happening. I don't think at this point in time, I still don't think the BOC is going to cut at this point. I do believe that their next move is a cut, but as for when it takes place, and it's because the culture at the BOC, they are hawkish. They're very conservative. They don't want to make a move unless they feel it's necessary to do it. And I think it's always done it in hindsight, of course. And so, Steve, you had the great question, Steve. You said it's not, I think you asked Rich, it's not what you think they should do. It's, what will they do, right? So at this point in time, the markets are saying, I think it's a 60% chance, Rich, that they're going to cut. I think
Yeah,
that's what
that's
it's
exactly
showing.
right.
Yeah. So as of right now, I want to take Rich's side on this, that they will not be a cut. But underneath the hood, right, they have a lot more information and data than we do. But if they do, just say they do cut again, and say then that automatically it provides an instant boost to the housing market, which then Rich will share by default. It should carry through with the shelter component, down the road. It should give a boost as well to retail spending and stuff like that. So, I mean, maybe then, Friedland, she has called, the bottom again, right? We're right back into a higher trending CPI number. But if you look at the core data points that came out, the previous month was revised higher. So even though the current month, it seemed like, in line or a little bit lower, it was based from a higher print. So,
Well, Keith, just one more thing on that. Like, so I think another way to think about it, and this is very more important in the US because I think more people spend time obsessed over the month-on-month data. But just the headline CPI rose 0.5% month on month. And if you do, I'm going to get myself into trouble doing math here, but if you do 0.5 times 12, it equals 6%. So that's a 6% annualized rate. Now it's a bit cheeky to do that, but I think that's something they think about. And I would say that if you saw a 6% annualized rate of inflation, that's not, I don't think that's grounds to cut at all. But I guess I'm talking my book a little bit, my Twinkie book.
I'm going to
you
add
actually
one.
have to annualize the formula, Rich. It's not just straight multiplication. So it's
I'm-
1.005 to the power of 12 minus
I know.
1. So you should come
Yeah.
out to 6, almost close to 7, maybe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Someone might
But
want to check that math.
but
Maybe the same guy that's going to check out the porcupine mating
yes, please.
Yeah.
process or something. Yeah.
We had a new head of research. To that point, just a purely anecdotal. I think we're seeing this.
Steve, I think there's a glitch in your matrix. I keep seeing the same bird flying the same direction behind you outside your window.
Man, you're really dialed in today.
I know. I'm focused.
We're seeing rents peak. Vancouver, like rents have peaked out. Toronto, I mean, we're hearing lots of stories, data actually, from some of these firms, Urbanation, things of that nature, that are showing rents are actually coming down. So I'll be kind of curious to see how that plays out over the next 3, 4, 5 months, and whether or not that filters through into the data. Like, again, I'm not even sure what rental data the BOC actually uses for determining rent inflation. But I think if you're strictly, talking to a property manager, actually putting a unit on the rental market today, I don't think you're getting higher rents. So we'll see.
Okay. Next.
Wow. What about, would you see this thing on food inflation?
No.
What was it? We've already had like the thing that, I know I was like, you get Christopher Freeland that comes out and says, well, it's back within the 2.7 or 2, whatever. It's back in the target range, yada, yada, yada. But for most people, right, prices are still going up.
Yes.
It's not like they're coming down. Like, your grocery bill is not getting any cheaper. It's not going up as much. So there's a good chart. Keep in mind, this is the US data, but this guy tweeted, he says it's never been more expensive to get diarrhea. And it shows it shows McDonald's and Taco Bell price increases. So for example, a Big Mac at McDonald's at the end of 2019 was $3.99, and today it's $7.49. So it's an 87% increase.
So that's not 2% a year. That seems to
No.
be a bit more, right?
Yeah, I don't know. They put like the beefy 5-layer burrito at Taco Bell. I don't even know what that is, but that sounds slippery. It was $1.69 at the end of 2019. Today it's $3.69, 118% increase. And they've got a whole bunch of items here for McDonald's. Medium fries went from $1.79 to $4.19, 134% increase. A cheeseburger went from $1 to $3.15. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, that's like, you think about like McDonald's food prices, which is like, a meal out or dinner out for a lower or medium income type of family, and you're seeing 100% increases over 3 years.
I was at the grocery store this morning, and it's you have to go through a process to get out of the grocery store area these days. So you just can't walk through the cashier place, so they'll have a chain over it and stuff like that. That's what we have down here. Anyway, this morning I was down there and I was leaving. I see this guy. He's walking through the aisle and he has his bag obviously filled with stuff that he has. He's wearing a hoodie. Then he has a mask on, like a balaclava, basically, like up over his nose. So it's just his eyes are showing. He walks through the cashier, like steps over the chain, and then out the door.
So you witness a shoplifter.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely what he's doing. And like people, like workers there, they're just watching him, and there's no action taking place. Someone hits a beep, like a beeper's going off or something, but no one's
Life
gonna
alert.
I'm thinking, like, do I tackle the guy? Do I do that? And
Did
or
you do
not?
it?
No, because it's not my fight, right?
Coward.
It's not my thing. I know.
Well-
I could have called him a very mean word that I heard the day before.
Well,
Hey, you stop stealing food. But I think though it is it does show that a lot of people though they are struggling with food
Maybe
prices.
he was an
Well, so
NDP supporter. He was giving the finger to Galen Weston.
That's right.
Loblaws boycott.
Who, by the way, has
Yeah.
lower margins than Metro. But just on the things, on the people struggling, and to avoid us having people call us bad names in the comment section, I think it's important to address two more things on the food thing. So food inflation from stores, food purchase from stores, inflation is down to 1.2%. It peaked at like 11.5 or 11%. And I think that number one, I think that grossly understates the amount of inflation we've had in food, full stop. And you could say that there's compositional issues, but I wanted to just quickly address two very important issues that I think are actually happening that are not at all expressed in what is a very flawed measure, the CPI basket, and even all of its sort of, the subcomponents of it, which is number one, shrinkflation, which is something we haven't talked about it at all, which is, you used to buy a box of Chips Ahoy and it used to be 500 grams for $3. And now it's, $4 for that. It's no longer 500 grams, it's like 400 grams. So not only has the price gone up, but like the number of the actual quantity that you're purchasing has gone down. And so it hides the actual increase in the price of food, because it takes a while for the lovely people at StatsCan to then go and see, oh, in fact, your box of Chips Ahoy is now down 20% and the price of that box is up 17 or 25%. And so the compounding effect of that is a much, much higher price of food than you were getting in 2020. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, substitution effect, which is I went to the grocery store the other day and it was $25 for at Metro, whatever. It was $25 for a steak, and mind you, the steak was the size of a dinner plate. But nevertheless, I when I was going up north to get scared by this porcupine, I substituted a steak to chicken or sausages. So I went down. The scale of product and sort of value. I went for a cheaper option. And so again, that hides sort of the impact of higher prices that people are feeling. And again, if you're poor or on low income, or you're very old, even older than Keith, God forbid, food is a much larger portion of your basket. And so you're especially impacted by things like shrinkflation and substitution effects, and that are not at all, maybe it's not clear at all that that's sort of it's not expressed at all in a food inflation number of 1.2 or whatever percent. I think that that's something
Well,
that,
yeah,
of course,
you hear that a lot
that's
on the
important.
earnings calls, right? I mean, remember, like, the CEO of Costco being like, yeah, we're seeing, people substituting,
Right.
beef for pork because, pork is cheaper, and they're seeing that. I mean, this is obviously, a massive company that has unbelievable data sets and analytics to determine what people are buying and what they aren't buying. And so to see them come out in all these earnings calls, not just Costco, but various retailers coming out and saying you're seeing the consumer downgrade what they would normally purchase, I think is kind of indicative of that. I mean, but I think there's always been the argument about inflation and measuring the basket, right? I mean, keep us in mind, like, the whole reason we kept rates at like 0% for the last like decade was because like inflation was what did they call it? Inflation was the problem of our time or something.
Yeah, something like that, where we
Janet Yellen
defeated.
said,
We defeated
because
it,
like
which is
inflation averaged like 1.8%. So like it wasn't technically at the 2% target. It was 1.8. This was a huge problem. So they decided to leave rates at 0 for a decade because the difference between 1.8 and 2 is somehow significant.
0.2, 0.2.
And it's just
But like,
insane.
but with
And then
the
they
individual,
inflated,
yeah, with the guy that I referenced earlier, I'm sure if you checked the bag, it probably wasn't full of Doritos or Chips Ahoy, and it's probably meat in there and stuff like that. And that's the point, is that, for policymakers to say, hey, inflation is now down to 2.7% or something like that. Hey, we fixed it, we win. It's completely being tone deaf, to the tens of thousands of people out there across the country who
Millions.
are struggling, or millions who are struggling to get not only food, but healthy food, on their table. And you know what? It doesn't get fixed, right? By bringing it, even though the rate of growth might be slowing, the price of this stuff has gone up, and it's not going to come back down again. Like, we're not going back to the $1.99 Big Mac day.
okay, well, here's another good stat for you. So, as of March 2023, there were over 1.9 million visits to food banks in Canada. This year's food bank usage represents a 32% increase compared to last year and a 78% increase compared to March of 2019. So a lot of people attending the food bank, which I think is indicative of really the overall impact that this inflation has had on people, despite, again, it coming down into the Bank of Canada's target range. I think the damage has been done. I think politicians that are out there, cheerleading the fact that you're now within the target range is insulting, truthfully, but I digress.
Any bets on whether or not the word transitory is going to come back in the next year when it finally does? If we have a recession, let's just say, and inflation does go down because there's no demand to support the excess to gobble up any excess supply, and prices do correct. Any wagers on whether or not a politician's going to come out and say, "See, we told you it is transitory"? Anyways,
I think you might have a whole new crop of politicians in by then.
Yeah, perhaps. Anyway.
Yeah, it's, what it is. A lot of people are really struggling. I think we all know that. Yeah. One interesting thing that I saw. So I think this week we have the G7 meeting, or is it just the G7 for the FinMins, the financial ministers? Is it the full G7? Everyone?
I'm Googling it quickly.
They're all getting on their jets.
So yeah, jet. They're all getting on their
G7
climate-free
of
jet
finance
in Italy.
ministers. Oh,
Okay, the Finlands.
G7 ministers and central bank governors say no to central bank digital currency.
It's in Italy, I think. I
Easy
think
bugs.
if you look there. But one thing, and of course the G7, like, is there anything more irrelevant these days than just those 7 countries? Then it became the G8, and I think it was the G8 plus Russia, and then plus
And they kicked
China.
them
But they're the bad guys now, so you can't include them anymore. And anyway, it goes around in circles. But one of the suggestions that they're trying to come to an agreement with is a global tax on billionaires. Right? So they're saying, hey, they have too much
Look out,
money.
Keith.
Yeah, I'm not quite there. And but people might say, oh, of course, we should go after them and all that stuff. And I say, you know what, it's kind of irrelevant. If you took all the billionaires' assets and you sold them and you used that to pay down the debt, like literally 3 weeks later, we're still back at the same level of debt again. Like, it doesn't make any impact whatsoever. So this is, it is a political stunt. However, what people should be concerned about is that if for some reason, the G7 lads there, they're able to agree, we should use this tax policy. The Americans, by the way, are totally against it. Janet Yellen has said, no, I don't agree with this.
Obviously.
Nancy Pelosi tapped her on the shoulder, right?
Yeah, Pelosi's like, hey, I watch football with Pelosi. Remember that? We're
best
football
hedge fund
friends.
manager, the best hedge fund manager that's ever was.
Yeah. But if they go after that wealth segment now, then it's only a matter of time before they expand the size of that. Remember, no matter how much tax they collect, it is never, ever enough. It just doesn't work. So I watched this back in 2012, I think it was. That's when the IMF came out with their famous paper, and they said, hey, if we do a 10% wealth tax right now for people around the world, we would collect this much in taxes, and we can reduce the total global debt, I think it was by 10%, or like, it was such an irrelevant amount. And this paper caused up quite the stir. And finally, the IMF, they had to withdraw it from the website. They had to take it down, say, oh, no, it was just a junior guy just floating an idea. But that's the way these policymakers work. They'll float the idea, they'll banter it about, see what the public reaction is to it. And right now, everyone in the public today, if you ask them, hey, should we tax the billionaires more? Everyone say, of course we should. Of course we would. But yet you don't realize that you're going to get that tax bracket creep, coming down eventually. But look for that this week. And again, yeah.
Hold on, I searched Chat GPT, so I'm not too sure how accurate this is, but it says if you were to confiscate all the wealth of the U.S. billionaires, it would be estimated around $5.5 trillion. So if you confiscated all of their wealth and used it to fund the U.S. government, it would cover approximately 8 months of federal spending,
which is a lot.
But then you're done. Then there's no more, like, you're funded for 8 months and then you're back to square one.
But 8 months sounds like a really big number.
Oh, Rich. I'm surprised it's that much, though. That's
me too. But also, wait, just so people, some context here. The vast majority of wealthy people pay the vast majority of taxes. Let's be, the ONS, which is the Office of National Statistics for the UK, estimated something like 40% of the UK, for example, I just have this stat on the top of my head, don't pay any taxes at all when you net out all of the benefits that they receive. So what happens really is this, by giving away freebies, what you do is you actually narrow the tax bracket, and rich people don't pay taxes anyways. So it's people who are income earners, high income earners pay the vast majority of taxes. Don't at me, just Google it. There's loads of research on it, Keith. Can I jump one more thing on the G7 meeting? So just Google it, news release, May 23rd, and says the Deputy Prime Minister will use the meetings as an opportunity to deepen international partnerships as the world races to build net zero economies. That's the first thing on her list. It's not going to happen. The net zero is a total fake thing. That's just never going to happen. And I would like to remind everybody that the OECD, which is the Office of Economic Cooperation, I never remember any acronyms. Anyway, OECD, which is about 85% of global GDP, their emissions peaked in 2008 at 10 billion metric tons and has been declining for whatever 15 years straight. So all this jibber jabber about emissions and stuff, I mean, it's just the total, again, and more theater, I would say. I'd take my gratuitous shot at the emissions thing. Go ahead.
Man, you've got me all over ChatGPT here. So going back to the high income taxpayers, top 1% of earners, which is $682,000 or more, paid approximately 46% of all federal income taxes in 2021.
Which country?
The U.S.
It's probably around the same in Canada. I can't imagine to be much different.
I don't use this chat GB. I still use. I have the AOL one on my.
You on Bing.
Yeah, Bing. Yeah, Earthlink and stuff like that.
Just one thing. The reason I think the reason we clarify, I really love to clarify these things and like attack these headlines head on, is because it's just these narratives get floated out there, and no one challenges them. And I think that's one of the fun things about being on the Loonie Hour. We have an opportunity to simply address these claims, to assess whether or not they're valuable or contribute to the flourishing of humanity in any way, or do they have merit or not. And I think, so forgive me if I went a little bit too on that.
Yeah, I'll take it a bit too far now, of course. That's what I always do. But, I with this global tax on billionaires and then G7, it's, okay, close your ears, Steve. You don't want to hear this one. It's really another step towards this, this dream of a one world government. And that's what they're trying to harmonize tax policy across all of these major countries. And you shouldn't have the same tax policy in all the countries. Each country and economy and culture is different. And anyway, but it's, we're moving closer and closer, to this synchronized either god-awful experience or an amazing experience. So you can choose which way this pendulum is swinging. But, you're able to see these little, pieces of evidence, on a weekly and monthly basis now. And this is yet another one, it's right in front of you. Just have to see it, Steve. Look hard enough and you'll see it there. And I don't need ChatGPT to tell me that one, right? It's pretty obvious.
So there's lots going on around the immigration side as well as in Canada. I don't know if you guys saw the charts that came out here, but we had
is this the official data?
Yeah, so StatsCan, I guess a lot of people were kind of waiting for it. We just got an update on the immigration figures. So the working age population, which is age 15 and over, rose by 100,000 people in April, bringing the total to over 410,000 after 4 months in 2024. So that's a 47% increase compared to the first 4 months.
410,000 in the first 4 months of the year.
Yeah, which is a 47% increase compared to last year. So if you thought sort of population growth was kind of nutty last year, we're beating that this year. So I don't really know what to tell you other than.
But prior to the this happening, whatever you want to call this, we were getting around that many on an annual basis, weren't we? Like during the O's, 2015 and 14 and 16 and stuff.
Correct. It was 400.
So when does this flow? I remember when we had Ben Rabideau on a few weeks back, he was suggesting this flow should slow down very dramatically soon. So I guess now it's turning into like a Q3. Will we get the majority of the growth in the first half of this year and then it stops or slows?
Well, I think one of the things he said, actually, I was following him on Twitter, is I think he said there's going to be lots of front loading, people trying to get in under the closing garage door, if that makes sense. So I think it's, in some ways, this should have been kind of expected. And I think it might be a little bit too early to call it, but it is a dramatic increase. I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? I think the data you're talking about, Steve, is from January to April. So they compare each year. Is that right?
Yeah. Basically, and then I mean, I don't know. There's just these guys are supposed to be cutting immigration targets. I don't know if it's actually like how this is actually going to play out. If this is just more like political speak to try to move up in the polls or not. We actually just had an announcement from Mark Miller today, immigration minister, noting that as long as a Canadian parent who was born outside of Canada has accumulated 3 years of time spent in Canada before the birth of their child abroad, they'll be able to pass down their citizenship. Okay. So it sounds like they're kind of fast tracking more citizenship in Canada.
It feels like 30 seconds of our life we'll never get back.
Should we move on then?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even.
Give you an anecdotal story though. So the local university here, is major university. They announced, this is new, so I'm not making it up. They're going to have about a $10 million operating budget shortfall this year, due to the declines that they're expecting for foreign students coming in. So it's huge. I mean, they're starting to lay off professors, support staff, trying to figure out this and that. So the policy decisions that were announced recently, they are having an impact locally. So, I mean, we can look around, for those anecdotal stories, but they are having an impact. So whether it actually happens or not, we'll have to see. But there you go.
Just on that, so our good buddy Ben Rabideau, he had a good post the other day. So on these immigration numbers, so just highlighting the annual growth in Canadian metros. So you had places like Moncton, New Brunswick, that grew by 6% last year, 6%. Calgary, everyone wonders why that housing market's doing so well. They grew by 6%. So their population expanded by 6% in a single year, which is just completely nuts. I mean, the average for Canada wide was 3%. So you have places like Calgary growing at 6%, Saskatoon growing at nearly 5%, Vancouver north of 4%. I mean, yeah, I don't see how you can ever build enough housing that quickly to accommodate that many people. But this has obviously been a thread of the Loonie Hour for several years now, since we started the show.
It's not a healthy number. It's not a good way to build social cohesion. It's not a good way to emancipate the working class people. It's a false promise for the people you've invited, the good, well-meaning people that you invited into your country. It's really sad, and it's going to build anti-immigration sentiment, which is the dumbest sort of outflow of all this. It's
Rich. Do you have the jobs, the random number generator? How many jobs were added between January and April? Because if your population of working age people grew by 410,000 people during that time, I don't think we created 410,000 new jobs.
No, we definitely didn't. We know this because the employment to population ratio has started to tick lower and lower. I think we've showed that chart before. It's just very disappointing. I don't know. This kind of stuff makes me really sad. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just, we aren't. I mean, that's just the way these things are going. I don't know. I have nothing more to say. Everybody's heard my sort of views on this. It's just disappointing.
While we're adding up all the things that we've got right, there was an article. There's an article in the National Post this week, which then ended up creating a whole bunch of debate in the in Parliament there. Between Freeland and Pierre Poilievre, and they're going back and forth. At which point Pierre called Freeland the worst mortgage broker Canada has ever seen, referencing that Ottawa borrowed 400, basically all the money they borrowed during the pandemic, and most of it was done on the shorter end of the yield curve. So they didn't lock in rates, 10-year term or 30-year term. So for this year, 414 billion of Canada's 1.4 trillion in debt. So 414 billion out of the 1.4 trillion in debt will be refinanced this year, all of course at today's higher interest rates.
So it's probably an extra 10 billion a year coming up in interest expense on that debt load that's going to be rolled over.
Yeah. I think it's
important to talk.
Sorry, go ahead.
I did have the employment number for you, but as I was communicating, I'm realizing I was muted, so you guys didn't even hear me. So for the first 4 months of the year, the combined net change of full-time jobs in Canada was about 100,000. So if we have 400 come in, it's 100 in new jobs. So I mean, I'm assuming all the 400 weren't able to work, you know, because you got kids and stuff like that.
Students and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rich, the countries. So the cost of interest the government will pay this year will be 54 billion, and that will rise to 64 billion by the end of the decade. But they made an interesting note here.
Wait, where's that number from, Steve? Because that's not that cannot be accurate.
The country's debt servicing cost, the cost of interest the government pays, will be 54 billion this year, rising to 64 billion by the end of the decade. This is from the National Post.
Yeah, correct. But if we're at 54 billion today, and they're saying by the end of the decade, it's going to be only going to be 64 billion. Is that what it says?
No, that can't be right.
Yeah, no, see, we're not doubting you're not
No, yeah,
reading
yeah.
the
I mean, this
sentence
is where
correctly, right?
someone
This
asked
is-
ChatGPT.
I mean, listen, again, it's not, again, I will stress this, and Keith is gonna punish me for it, surely, but it's not about borrowing. It's what you do with the money. And the fact is, if you're investing in bridges and roads and high-speed rails and satellite dishes and, you know, semiconductor factories, then maybe, just maybe, the borrowing is worth it. But we know that that's not what's happening. I mean, there's some improvement in gross fixed capital formation by the government, but I'm looking at the data right now, 87 billion in real terms to 93 billion in real terms over the last 2 years. And in general, our fixed capital formation for the country has basically been stagnant for years and years. In fact, it's down. I've shared this chart before. So it's down 20% from the peak. So that's the real issue. This is why productivity is an issue. This is why inflation is going to be sticky. It's not that we hate immigrants. Ridiculous. My parents are immigrants. Immigrants are great. It's about the quantum and the speed, and if they're the right match for your economy or not, what they're doing, where they're going, etc. It takes thinking about things before you enact policy. And Airbnb is another example of this, and so is population.
Hey, Rich.
Tell
I'm
me.
picking up what you're putting down. That's 100% correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Boomer, what are you looking at these days? What's keeping you up in the markets besides Christopher Freeland tweets?
A couple of market-related things. Japanese yen continues to snooze everyone to sleep, and it's getting weaker and weaker. We're now so yen is down 50% since 2011. 50% over the last 13 years, right? It's leaking lower and lower and lower. The 10-year yield on the Japanese government bond, or the JGB as we'd call it, remember that was negative, and it was a 0% in 21. So 3 years later, it's now at 1%. People say,
isn't that just like
deal.
A brilliant way though to think about like your wealth and your net worth, which is like, you know, you think about someone in Japan that maybe is not tuned into the Loonie Hour, is maybe not necessarily aware of what's going on with their currency. They just kind of seen this slow bleed where, you know, a decade later, their currency is down 50% against the US dollar, you know, and you're measuring your net worth. I think it's just an important lesson for Canadians, right? I mean, if all of your net worth and your assets are here in Canada, you know, if you own a house and 3 pre-sale condos, like your entire net worth is just tied up into like one asset, and more importantly, one currency. And, you know, that currency is ultimately at the mercy of the political leaders that you vote in, really. I mean, they're kind of pulling the strings on the economy. So, I mean, I think it's just an important lesson to see what's happening in Japan and bringing that back home here.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, they always dismiss Japan. They say, oh, that's Japan. They've been in that world forever, you know, this and that. Let's be, but again, let's not turn this into a whole, you know, we had the Japanese discussion, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But this is catching my attention. Like, the Japanese experience continues to deteriorate from an aggregate position. So that's clearly, you know, catching my attention right now. And then something from a more micro level, I noticed this morning, I think both you guys saw this story as well. But so for the first time since 2010, there was a AAA CMBS, commercial mortgage-backed security fund. It's had losses. So they distributed, you know, they sold the assets, distributed out to shareholders. or unit holders. So people got back 75 cents on the dollar of what they put in on the CMBS. So there's one narrative going on right now is that, households are still spending, they'll always spend all that stuff. And then the part of so by default, that would keep mortgage loan portfolios, okay, unless we have a deep recession. But it's the commercial property market, that people are focused on, and the fear is that could evolve into something or accelerate into something. So this, that narrative has been there. Now we finally seen the first crack. So this could be a property specific problem. So that means it's specific to the CMBS, or it could be the beginning of something else. But you might also notice, everyone, in the last 2 days, a story on the big Canadian pension plan, pension fund. They're reducing exposure to commercial real estate as well. And
A little late.
but when one person sells something, right? You got to remember this as well. When one person sells it, it's like, oh wow, everyone's getting out. Somebody else is buying it, by default. So you have to look at it that way. But but see, this is something that's catching my attention as well, is the commercial real estate side, and that's coming out of the U.S., not so much here in Canada right now.
Yeah, just kind of feel like markets are still kind of lulled to sleep a little bit.
Well, yeah, we just hit an all-time high in MSCI Global, ACWI as it's called, All Country World Index, which includes emerging markets and developed markets, hit an all-time high. The thing that catching my eye is the move in copper, nickel, a lot of these industrial metals, copper and zinc, I'm sorry, which are very closely related because of when you mine them and process them, they're linked. But I mean, they're up massively, partly because of the constraints that Chinese smelters have put on. They've built too much capacity, and there's not enough output coming from places like Peru, Congo, Australia, and there's one more I can't remember. I always forget. And so there's not enough mines and not enough, and so that's been squeezing the price of very, very important metal. And so that to me is really interesting. Also, the other thing that I thought was interesting is that oil prices have actually come off quite a bit. So that's that piece. And then another thing on the Europe front, which I've been making fun of Germany for a long time because shutting down 6 perfectly good nuclear power plants is basically a crime against humanity. Their energy prices have actually come down so much because there's so much excess supply of natural gas, that they've been able to restart just tentatively been restarting a couple of their key industries. So aluminum, for example, some of their factories went back online, and their sentiment, there's something called the ZEW, which is some German acronym, which I can never remember. There's the IFO Institute. So that's been actually sort of rebounding a little bit. So there's actually some tentative signs. So the patient is no longer in the ICU. It's been wheeled out to a different part of the hospital. But it's funny. That's a really, really important factor for global risk appetite and economic growth, is what's going on in Germany. And then China's equity market is one of the best equity markets that's since February. Since then they started to intervene. So that's really interesting too.
You first.
Just imagine if they didn't intervene.
Oh, I mean, it would be they've had to, right? They've had to. I mean, the intervention's been twofold. One, it was they called quote unquote national team, which was in February. And the most recent intervention was literally just lowering mortgage rates, lowering first-time buyer kind of rules, and then pumping liquidity in order to literally arrest the price declines of houses. The official numbers are like 3% and 4% year-on-year declines for the houses. I mean, I think those are bogus. I think it's a much, much, much lower. But the market is smarter than us. And if you look at property developer indexes for China, they're up. And you could argue that China has lots of problems, but the equity market is interesting, and it does tell you it is an amalgam of information and sentiment, and it had been creeping higher. So this is off after it fell 90%. We're now up a tiny bit, but it does tell you that something has changed.
Thank you for putting that into perspective at the end. I was like, oh. As you know, like in our world, you can make any chart tell any story you want. You just change
Yeah.
the, the X or Y axis, to show it.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
This is
What
it.
about? Is there anything else?
Is that goodbye? Are you
No,
saying
no,
buy
TD
as in
earnings.
purchase?
You're
Or
going to
is
talk
it?
about?
I
We
think
gotta wrap
Steve
this-
is
we gotta
saying.
wrap
Are
this
you
thing
saying
up.
goodbye or buy? This is like
BUY.
confusing.
It's time to buy BUY, but also we do need to say goodbye,
Oh,
and that is the end of
okay.
the show.
That's-
We'll get into China selling the U.S. Treasuries and what's going on in the gold market and how that's kind of all playing out. We want to get
Bitcoin.
into that, but Bitcoin, people get upset when we don't talk about Bitcoin. It's moving. I think it's a measure of liquidity, and the
guys,
crypto markets are.
I
are
need
running.
to say a quick hello. I was chatting with a couple this morning, Lyd and Brian. So it's this couple. They're over in. They're based in Hong Kong, and they
No
follow the
way.
show every week. They love the show, and you know who their favorite Loonie Hour personality is? Dun,
You?
dun, dun. No, it's
probably
Rich.
you.
It's always Rich. Rich wins all the
What?
time. Yes.
Oh.
So, guys, now, hey, we have coverage from the four corners of the world. We have Halifax, Kitsilano, Hong Kong, and Saskatchewan.
Well, someone recognized me on the metro the other day. That was nice. I had a chat with him on the way home. I think his name is Olivier. There you go.
Someone recognized Keith on his bicycle.
Yeah, that's
Gave him
right.
a piece of their mind.
It's probably a Liberal Party MP.
All right, that's a good place to wrap it up. As always, guys, appreciate the support, and we'll see you next week.